Michael Bloomberg, Mark Zuckerberg, Sheldon Adelson, and George Soros. Billionaires are trying to influence politics, but can they actually buy elections? This is America Uncovered. I'm Matt Gnezda, filling in for Chris Chappell. Chris is in Taiwan today. Check out our other channel, China Uncensored, for coverage of how China is trying to subvert Taiwan's 2020 elections. Speaking of 2020 elections, here in America there seems to be less concern about the influence of China and more concern about the influence of money, especially big money from billionaires. Billionaires who are trying to influence who or what the rest of us vote for. Let's start with presidential hopeful and mega-billionaire Michael Bloomberg. We recently did an episode about Bloomberg's friendly relationship with China, a country that is definitely not led by a dictator, according to Michael Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg is worth more than $55 billion. As of the end of December, he had already spent more than $100 million in campaign ads. His late entry into the Democratic primary has sparked headlines like, "Will Bloomberg buy the election?" We'll come back to that. But Bloomberg is not the only billionaire in the primaries. Here's billionaire presidential candidate Tom Steyer. Look familiar? I hope not. That's a random guy I found on Shutterstock. This is presidential candidate Tom Steyer. He's one of the 14 Democratic candidates running in the primaries. So you've seen him, but let's be honest, he's about as exciting as a head of cauliflower. Actually, if that were real, it would be more exciting than Tom Steyer. I hear cauliflower is the new it vegetable. Anyway, Tom Steyer is a California hedge fund manager turned environmentalist. His net worth is about $1.6 billion. As of the end of December, he'd spent more than $80 million on advertisements for his 2020 campaign. So obviously, he's also trying to buy his way into politics. But he's been polling at less than 3%, so let's be honest, he's not going to win. But this isn't the first time Tom Steyer has thrown his enormous wealth into politics. About a year ago, Tom Steyer used his Next Gen Climate Action charity to spend roughly $10 million pushing ballot measures in Nevada and Arizona that would require those states to get half their power through renewable energy. He does not live in those states, but he wanted to influence the laws in those states. One opponent of the Arizona measure said, "We believe strongly that a California billionaire coming into Arizona and spending $10 to $20 million to cram this thing down our throats is problematic." Don't worry, Tom Steyer has repeatedly spoken out against how big rich corporations are controlling our politics. Right. Speaking of big rich corporations, Facebook, and Facebook founder and fellow billionaire Mark Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg is not running for president, but he's no stranger to throwing his money behind political activism. In 2018, he gave $1 million for a ballot measure to soften penalties for drug possession in Ohio, a state where he does not live, although he did one time visit Ohio, where he showed up at a random family's house for dinner. And then there's billionaire George Soros. He's in a category all his own. He made most of his vast fortune through Wall Street trading and asset management, starting in the 1950s. He's at least 200 years old. Over the years and across the world, Soros has donated roughly $32 billion to various progressive causes. A lot of it was through his network called the Open Society Foundations. They call themselves the world's largest private funder of independent groups working for justice, democratic governance, and human rights. $32 billion is a lot of money. And you might think that justice, democratic governance, and human rights are good things. But his critics, and there are a lot of them, say he's all about using money to influence politics. Meanwhile, his supporters say he's all about using money to influence politics. When it comes to the current presidential campaign season, last year Soros spent $5.1 million to set up a super PAC called Democracy PAC. Super PACs, or Super Political Action Committees, aren't allowed to make contributions to specific parties or candidates, but they can spend on political causes which just happen to be in line with specific parties or candidates, and there are no limits to how much money a super PAC can spend. It's still unclear exactly what George Soros' super PAC is going to do, but it will probably support whichever candidate ends up running against Trump. Unless it's Vermin Supreme. Vermin, you're on your own. On the non-progressive side, you have billionaires like Sheldon Adelson, who is also 200 years old. He made his money helping children. Just kidding, he owns a bunch of casinos. He made billions of dollars being the guy who actually makes money from repeated gambling. Other people's gambling. Adelson has contributed more than $100 million to conservative political groups like the Congressional Leadership Fund Super PAC. And in 2016, Adelson gave $25 million to a pro-Trump Super PAC. And I'm sure you've heard of the famous billionaire Koch brothers. Now just Koch brothers, since one of them died last year. In 2018, they launched their own Super PAC to support conservative candidates in the US midterm elections. And then there's billionaire Rupert Murdoch, owner of News Corp. He owns more than a dozen media companies that can all provide the information voters need to make uninformed decisions at the polls. I trust Rupert Murdoch's New York Post for the most thoughtful, nuanced political discussion. And these several billionaires I mentioned are just the tip of the incredibly rich iceberg, especially when it comes to some of the smaller political issues like state laws. That's because at least 25 billionaires have given more than $70 million to statewide ballot measures in 19 states where they do not reside. There are a lot of very rich people who are spending vast sums of money to influence your votes. So back to the question, can a small number of billionaires actually sway voters? Well, sometimes yes and sometimes no. Yes seems to happen more with state-level measures. You know, the kind of thing where you see the sign, but you don't really do the research. What's Proposition 173? I guess I should vote yes. Well, you are a terrible person because Proposition 173 was about legalizing child labor. Small hands. Good for making stuff. Think of the children. Anyway, back to that $70 million spent on state ballot measures. This article from 2018 says that out-of-state billionaires' bets on some of the highest profile initiatives mostly paid off. It says voters agreed with at least 14 of 22 ballot measure campaigns backed by billionaires from other states. Maybe some of them would have passed anyway. But for votes that are close, millions of dollars can make an important difference in swaying public opinion, especially if the issue seems minor and voters aren't paying attention or don't realize which special interest groups are behind it. Billionaires can also have an outsized influence in local or state elections, especially primaries, by giving their favorite candidates enough money to be competitive. But when it comes to presidential candidates, will money sway voters? And will Bloomberg buy the election? Well, the good news is that voters are actually paying attention to the presidential candidates. You watch the debates, or at least the first couple debates, and then, you were busy. But you've done your homework. You've argued with your best friend about why your candidate is better. And you've lost your best friend. These kinds of debates and arguments are why money is not the be-all, end-all in presidential politics. In fact, in 2016, Trump won with half as much money as Clinton raised. Which just goes to show, money can't buy you love. And how are Steyer and Bloomberg faring in the run-up to 2020? As I mentioned, they've already spent more than $180 million on their presidential campaigns. But despite all that cash, the most recent polls put Bloomberg at 3% and Steyer at just 2%. So running for president is not looking like good value for money for those two guys. And on top of that, some of their Democratic Party opponents are crying foul. Poor rich guys. I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. Actually, I would. I just wouldn't run for president. So what do you think about billionaires' impact on American politics? Leave your comments below. I'm Matt Gnezda. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.